Park Jun said that they just came to get his things and that he had written to him. The boys were walking in a hug and discussing something of their own. My brother asked Park Jun if they had filmed 100 people, but this question made him panic and he looked back. Park Jun looked at Yeon-woo and his reaction to the boys' words that they had only infected many people, and his friend just laughed at him. He asked Park Jun why he was so tense, but he was not speaking clearly and tried to change the conversation. Yeon-woo understood his behavior but did not react. He seemed to feel useful among these people. The teenager was only thinking about where they all got the cells. Lee Yeon-woo tried to focus on his feelings. Then he saw the cells right under the guy's sleeves, and the other guy felt a flamethrower from the infection. It was something else. The guy who saw them all off and asked what had happened to Yeon-woo's face and where he was from was looking at him carefully. But the teenager was silent, so the others answered that he was from Cheonan, and the boy added that Yeon-woo was from the same school he had once attended. Then, the man said that his younger son was there and asked him what Yeon-woo's name was. The teenager answered without looking up. The man started repeating his name, as if he was trying to remember something similar. Then the teenager looked up and looked at the man. He stopped, turned to Yeon-woo, and their eyes met. The man said he had an interesting name and asked if the teenager understood what they were doing here. Yeon-woo showed dissatisfaction with his whole appearance and looked closely into my eyes. The man asked what kind of expression the teenager had on his face and asked what he didn't like. But Yeon-woo looked down and thought that they were all just trash and scum. The man asked if Yeon-woo was really their friend. The teenager looked at the man's hands. They were infected and wondered why they were all still alive. Then she yelled at the man, saying that if he continued to behave like this, she would leave. The man was scared and began to back away, saying he was just joking and offering to work with Yeon-woo. The girl whispered to the teenager that if he made a fuss, he would not find his friend. She looked Yeon-woo in the eye and promised that she would help him find his friend and save him. But the teenager just walked forward, speeding up his gait, and then he added that there was only one piece of garbage here anyway. And the girl fell for this provocation and got angry. Meanwhile, the guy with the fire extinguisher was on the phone and chatting with someone. After that, he called his brother and arranged to meet. Yeon-woo's attention was drawn to the information that his school friend was also here. The events were moved to the 5th exit of the room. Leaning against the wall was a guy wearing a cap and holding a phone. It turned out to be Han Song-yu. He was supposed to be with Isuri and Kang Min, but it seems that their paths diverged then. Meanwhile, a company approached him, and he cheerfully greeted his brother. Suddenly, his joy turned to surprise when the company came closer to him. Han Seong-yu saw Lee Yeon-woo and his surprise was overwhelming, and he shouted out his classmate's name in shock. The company headed up the escalator to the exit. Han Seong-yu went first and told his brother that it was clean and without soldiers. The teenager spoke strangely, like a cattleman. Then he offered to smoke and move on. It seemed that Han Seong-yu was running away from something or someone, but they caught up with him, and Yeon-woo said he was glad the teenager was safe. He caught up with Han Seong-yu and added that he didn't expect to see him here when his classmate turned to him. A smile appeared on the teenager's face and he asked how things were in Yeon-woo and what was going on here. And then Han Song-yu asked if that was the last time they had seen each other in a homeless shelter. He asked how Yeon-woo escaped and was not caught, and then apologized for that time, saying that Isuri had abandoned him. Han Seong-yu added that she was also looking out for him and asked if Yeon-woo realized this. Then the teenager asked who all these people were and whether he had communicated with them. Han Seong-yu said that it was his brothers who took care of him and they were very good in fact. Yeon-woo asked if it was true that they were just selling the cells to others. But Han Seong-yu just laughed at all this and asked where he had gotten his guesses from. And then he asked if Yeon-woo was really interested. Han Song-yu offered to listen to his story. He asked Yeon-woo if he knew how the gang obtained the cells. The teenager turned and looked at his classmate, and he said that it was all about arguments, and that they had produced a mutant. A smile appeared on Han Seong-yu's face. Meanwhile, the events moved to the church. Behind the glass was a hall where everyone prayed and held services. There was no one inside, but we could hear prayer. The woman with the glasses was sitting behind me, reading the prayer as she wanted. She was trembling, but believed it would help her. The woman looked at the cross hanging on the wall. Virus cells suddenly began to appear on her face. Unfortunately, prayer did not help with such things. Two women came inside, not noticing anything and just talking to each other. But when they went deeper, they froze in shock and fear. In front of them was a huge monster that resembled a bird with large bone-shaped wings. Meanwhile, the pastor prayed and cried. He said that he saw and heard the voice of angels surrounding the throne of God. Other people prayed with him, and on the ceiling hung a huge monster, wrapped in a cocoon. One woman lifted her head slightly and opened her eye to look at the monster. The prayer said that their sister had performed a miracle with her sincere faith. Then the pastor opened his eyes, looked at the monster, and said that she had been born in the form of an angel by the voice of the Lord. Amen. Meanwhile, the blogger's video about the Khan River said that it was dangerous and many people died there. Isuri was sitting in the hallway watching him. The guy was talking about immunity and more specifically about Lee Yeon-woo. The girl watched and listened carefully to what the blogger was saying. If before it was nonsense, now it was the opposite. The guy said that in the future they would face something worse than incubation. He argued that as generations changed, species also changed, so we should stop panicking. Isuri, meanwhile, came down the stairs and walked somewhere with a stony face, thinking about the blogger's video. She met Kang Min, and the teenagers simultaneously rushed at each other with questions about what they were doing. The guy asked Isura if she had anything like a thermos. Kang Ming pointed to the hot water tank, and the girl indignantly asked why he was experimenting here. But the guy was angry about it, saying that he was trying to save them, not conduct experiments. Isuri looked silently at her friend and his indignation. Meanwhile, outside, soldiers burned all the cells left by the pigeons. For one bird, 2 soldiers and flamethrowers were too many. Behind the glass, a crowd of people stood and watched carefully what was happening outside, because they would not be released until everything was clear. Kang Ji-hoon stood behind me and listened to everything people were saying. The teenager watched the soldiers work carefully. He seemed to sincerely enjoy it. Suddenly, he noticed something terrible. His eyes widened and his heart beat faster. A girl was sitting on the floor in the middle of the fire and was being burned alive. Kang Ji-hoon began to make his way through the crowd and shouted for everyone to stop. When the teenager got closer, he carefully examined everything that was happening. But now there was no girl among the fire. Then Kang Ji-hoon simply turned around and walked away. The crowd stared at him in outrage. Suddenly, someone called out to the teenager and asked if he was going alone. It was Isuri. She asked if Kang Ji-hoon knew about denial, anger, depression, and acceptance. Then she told him to do a self-diagnosis and determine what stage he was at. Kang Ji-hoon came back and asked what Isuri meant. The girl said that the teenager was still angry and added that Lee Yeon-woo was not joking. Kang Ji-hoon did not listen any further and simply walked away, giving his classmate the middle finger. But Isuri went on to say that Lee Hong-mi could be brought back to life and asked if this was not a denial of reality. She went on to say that people died and were born, and zombies and infection. But Isuri didn't have time to finish, because Kang Ji-hoon interrupted her and came very close, asking why the girl was not infected. The teenager became very angry, accusing Isuri of not even being near the Han River. And if she was ready to save Yeonhwa, she could go and do it herself. But Isuri asked why she had to do it, explaining that she was just curious. Kang Min and Park Choa were coming up the stairs from below, and they didn't hear the whole conversation, but they understood that there was a quarrel. The classmates ignored them and continued to argue. Kang Ji-hoon told Isuri to be straightforward and say how long they were going to pick on Lee Yeon-woo, but the girl with the calm face and voice said that it would be as long as it took, and asked in response how long Kang Ji-hoon was going to suffer with the bullshit. Then the teenager lowered his head and just laughed. He said he was sick of it all. His voice said that something terrible was about to happen. Kang Ji-hoon's teeth clenched, and he said through them that Lee Yeon-woo was just a scumbag who ran away. And this thought just tore him apart. Meanwhile, soldiers were climbing the stairs and their footsteps could be heard. Kang Ji-hoon wanted to continue his monologue about hating Yeon-woo, but they were interrupted. Soldiers came and asked the teenagers to get out of the way. They stopped the people praying over the monster, and the pastor wanted to stop the military. The soldier said they had a report. The pastor did not like this very much and asked again indignantly. The soldier asked if there were any infected or monsters in the worship hall, but the shepherd sharply and quickly began to deny it, saying that no one was inside. In fact, he lied and his reaction gave the man away. At that moment, another pastor was sitting right next to the monster and praying loudly. The man ended the prayer with an oath of loyalty to God. At that moment, he opened his eyes, and the monster growled. The monster looked directly at the shepherd. Strange sounds from the worship hall reached the military, whom the believers tried so hard to stop. Then, the soldiers had to use brute force to make them all disperse and make way for them. The soldiers opened the doors of the hall and immediately pointed their weapons in case they were infected. But what they saw simply stunned them. At first glance, the hall looked empty and clean, but the sounds were coming for a reason. Then people behind the soldiers started screaming in terror. In the other corner was a cluster of cells, and they understood what it meant. People began to flee and break through the military. Kang Min and Isuri noticed this as they approached the worship hall. Meanwhile, the events moved to the stairs. Someone was sitting alone by the bulletin board. It was Kang Ji-hoon. He went downstairs to be alone and calm down. He turned around and looked at the board and what was written on it. There were various prayers and instructions. Park Choa suddenly approached the teenager and asked if he had prayed. Without waiting for an answer, the girl called Kang Ji-hoon strange and said that Jesus would not help them now. The teenager just swore. Then Park Choa asked if he felt guilty. Kang Ji-hoon turned and looked at the girl. and she continued that the teenager was exhausted. After that, she just turned around and left, saying that she would come back later because she wanted to go downstairs. Kang Ji-hoon didn't say anything, and just thought about Park Choa's words. The girl kept walking but did not turn back. Suddenly she stopped, because she suddenly remembered that she hadn't seen Seon-young for a long time. Park Choa was walking down the hallway looking for her classmate. The girl opened one of the doors, entered, and called out to Seon-young. Suddenly Park Cho stopped and stood in a stupor at what she saw. In front of her was a huge monster that ate people. The monster was busy and didn't notice Park Choa. Then she decided to immediately cautiously flee the premises. Cold sweat ran down her face and she kept looking back to control the situation. Park Choa literally tiptoed out of the room and walked down the hall. At that moment, Kang Ji-hoon came in and loudly asked Park Choa where everyone had gone. He continued to speak, but when he saw the expression on his classmate's face, he abruptly stopped talking. The girl had no face, it just screamed danger and fear. She quietly ordered Kang Ji-hoon to stand still and not move. Cold sweat was running down her face. The teenager froze and did not even breathe. Meanwhile, the monster in the room heard something and was distracted. At this point, the monster broke the glass and attacked Park Choa, but the girl quickly reacted and began to run away. The monster landed in the corridor and looked at the teenagers who were running away from it. Kang Ji-hoon and Park Choa started running as fast as they could. The boy asked what it was, but the girl didn't know and just ran away. The monster was in no hurry to run after them and just growled. Then he shouted so loudly that the whole church seemed to hear it. Kang Ji-hoon also heard these sounds and turned back in shock. The teenagers were climbing up the stairs and the boy was surprised because the monsters couldn't be inside. A soldier was standing upstairs, and he radioed that he was on the 3rd floor and was assessing the situation. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps and shouts from teenagers. They ran up to the man and shouted that a monster was chasing them, and that everyone had to get out of the room as soon as possible. The soldier was in no hurry to run and wanted to understand what was happening, but there was nothing behind me on the stairs and no sound of a monster. The man didn't seem to believe them very much, saying that he hadn't seen anyone but them, but Kang Ji-hoon tried to persuade him to run away. At this point, the man seemed to agree, but the distrust remained, and it was then that the monster caught up with them. When the soldier noticed him, it was too late. The monster attacked him, and the teenagers hid in fear. They fell to the floor and gasped loudly, coming to their senses and realizing that they were alive. When the teenagers returned, they saw a huge monster attacking a soldier. Suddenly, it started talking to them. The monster turned its head and said not to be afraid of it. But the teenagers reacted to these words by running. They took off right away and ran as fast as they could. The monster was not in a hurry to follow them and just stood over the body of the soldier. The teenagers kept running and did not turn back. The monster opened its mouth. After that, it screamed loudly again. Meanwhile, the events moved to the worship hall. People gathered around the priest. Believers put their hands over their mouths in shock and despair. The pastor was covered in cells and virus. He did not move and showed no signs of life. Kang Min and Isuri were sitting behind me, listening attentively to everything the soldiers said. And the guy was filming everything with his phone camera. Kang Ming suggested that when the man prayed, he was swallowed up. Isuri told them that they had better deal with everything quickly, because the door was closed. The girl thought further that the monster was inside, and that the priest had allowed himself to be infected. Isuri started looking around the room and noticed a window. She assumed that there was a window inside and that it was possible to leave through it. Kang Min supported him, saying that something strange had happened here, and that it was most likely that the priest was in the incubation period, and suggested that he leave. Suddenly, a strange sound was heard, and Isuri turned back. It seemed that these sounds were coming from the door on the other side of the room. Then everyone else in the room turned to the sound as well. People were just standing in a stupor waiting for something to happen. Then they started knocking on the door. After that, the sounds of laughing began to be heard, but it was unclear whether it was a monster or a person. The soldiers looked at each other. They signaled each other because they realized that the situation was strange and possibly dangerous. Then they started approaching the door with weapons. There was no sound outside the door, and this silence was only more frightening. Isuri and Kang Min hid behind him, and the boy continued to film everything that was happening. The soldier walked very carefully and slowly, pointing his weapon at the door. Then he reached for the handle to open the door. His heart was beating loudly. His blood pressure was skyrocketing, and there was tension in the air. After that, the man simply gathered his thoughts and opened the door. But looking around, everything was clear. The man looked in the other direction and was about to go back in, because there was no threat. The soldier came back and told the others that there was no one there. Isuri stared open-mouthed at what was happening. She carefully examined the weapon in the soldier's hands. Isuri asked Kang Min what it was, because she had never seen anything like it before. The boy explained that it was probably a flamethrower, but made of gas. Then, suddenly, virus cells began to sneak out from under the bottom of the wall. The soldier heard the sound but didn't see anything strange at first. And when he returned, he saw that the cells had begun to make their way through and there were even more of them, and the man fell to the ground in fear. People inside also began to fall and turn back screaming. The believers froze, covering their mouths with their hands in fear and shock. Meanwhile, the cells grew in number and covered the entire floor. The soldier was shouting at his partner to make sure he had checked everything well. The man swore that there was nothing there. He didn't notice anything. Then, the cells suddenly started spitting and scattering their small parts on the floor. The soldier then shouted that where could these cells have come from and how did they get inside? The men started shooting back. A partner with a flamethrower opened fire on the cells. One of them ordered everyone to quickly run for the exit, and then he gave the order to burn everything in the room. But he was suddenly stopped by the pastor, who said that he could not burn down the entire worship hall. Another soldier also stopped his partner. They looked around. The cells were burning and no longer posed such a threat as before. The man exhaled and said that it was all very strange. Suddenly, the priest began to say that they had definitely cleared everything, and then he began to pray and ask the Lord for forgiveness for his sins. The soldier cursed and shouted at the priest, asking if it was the right time for prayer. He was saying that right now many lives were being lost, and they were sitting here praying. The priest said that it was a test of the Lord himself, and that they were all just sinners. Suddenly, virus cells began to drip onto the soldier's suit. They appeared as if out of nowhere, just from the ceiling. His eyes widened sharply, and his heart began to beat faster. At that very moment, a huge monster attacked him from the ceiling. The man did not have time to escape or defend himself, so he had to take the brunt of the attack himself. The monster growled and opened its huge mouth. Others began to quickly run away screaming. Suddenly, the monster spoke and said that I shouldn't have looked back and been afraid of him. The priests and other believers stopped and watched what was happening. The monster said that what they all saw was just his appearance. Suddenly, a face began to appear from under the cells. The other pastors were in a stupor because they seemed to recognize the man. The face spoke of their faith, and that by the grace of the Lord they had chosen their weakness. One of the pastors was sure that it was their elder and asked the man about it. A soldier was climbing next to me and he fell when he ran away in fear. The man looked down and saw that his partner had been killed, but there was also a flamethrower next to him. The soldier began to run quickly to get his weapon. Suddenly, the tentacles of the virus wrapped around the flamethrower right in front of the man's hands. The monster turned to him and ordered him not to give in to the spirit of temptation. And then he told me to pray for repentance. This was all said by their elder. Meanwhile, Isuri and Kangmin were getting out of the room through that window when they heard loud screams. Isuri went back to see what was going on. The girl saw a horrifying picture of a monster devouring everyone who was nearby. Meanwhile, Kang Ming had also climbed out, and the teenagers had almost escaped. Suddenly, someone distracted the monster's attention and he turned aside. It turned out to be a soldier on whom he had fallen. The man raised his weapon with trembling hands. After that, he wished me to die. Meanwhile, the teenagers got out of this madness and ran down the corridors as fast as they could. They ran through a room and Isuri said they had to find a way out quickly. But Kang Min asked in response what they were supposed to do with the others, and Isuri did not know. As they ran, they saw another monster ahead of them. He was the soldier who was infected by the monster. The teenagers decided to turn and run up the stairs, but unfortunately they reached a dead end and had nowhere else to go. Then, at the same time, they decided to go into one of the rooms and hide there. Kang Min was the last to enter and closed the door behind him. When the teenagers came in and realized they were safe, they calmed down and loudly laughed. They looked at the door as if they expected someone to come in and catch them, but there was no one and nothing there, and the teenagers were able to break away and escape. Then the classmates exhaled and relaxed to the end. Kang Min said they had to find the others. Suddenly he heard the sound of the phone ringing at that moment. It turned out to be Kang Ji-hoon. He called his friend and immediately asked where they were. Kang Ming asked him the same counter question, and then asked if his friend could bring him something like fire. The teenager asked to hurry, and said they were on the 3rd floor. But Kang Ji-hoon said that they were also in an ambush, and that this monster was as if invisible. Then the teenager looked to the side and said that they had the same situation. Outside the door, he saw quarantine soldiers approaching the church. Kang Ji-hoon informed Kang Min about this. Isuri was eavesdropping on their conversation when suddenly something occurred to her. Kang Min continued to talk to his friend about something when Isuri called out to the teenager. She told him to hang up and look down. The look on Kang Ming's face changed dramatically. Her eyes widened and cold sweat ran down her cheeks. Isuri said that they had to find a way quickly, otherwise everyone would die, because the virus cells had begun to crawl through the door. Meanwhile, the military had already entered the church with weapons. The man who went first ordered his partner to look to the side, but he didn't notice anything. It was empty. Park Choa and Kang Ji-hoon were behind the glass. The girl asked if they had come here because of the quarantine, and the boy asked if they were going to catch them. The soldier who was burning everything inside was asked if he was worried about them, but the man answered in the negative. Meanwhile, Kang-min and Isuri were no better off. The monster was getting deeper and deeper into their hideout and seemed to sense the victims. Isuri opened the door to the closet where she kept her ministry clothes. These clothes could have been useful to them, but they just had to think it through and plan properly. Isuri looked into the closet and panicked, cold sweat streaming down her face. She knew she had to think of something fast. Suddenly, Kang-min interrupted the girl's thoughts and called out to her in a frightened voice. It turned out that the cells very quickly penetrated the room and were ready to attack the teenagers. Kang-min was screaming and panicking that the monster had almost come to them, but Isuri ordered him to shut up because he was disturbing her thinking. The girl looked around, namely upstairs, looking for any way out of the room. But there was nothing there, so Isuri ran along the ceiling, looking for a way out in different corners. Unfortunately, there was not even a ventilation hole to get out of. Then she thought she could make a barricade out of the cabinets in front of the door. But this idea didn't work either, because the monster was too close. The girl started to panic. She didn't know what to do. Isuri told Kang-min that there were no windows. The boy suggested that they just push the monster in. Then, the girl suggested that Kang-min play a rock-scissors-paper game, but the boy did not understand what she was getting at. Isuri explained that one of them would be the bait when the door opened, adding that the smartest thing to do now would be to sacrifice one of us. But Kang-min was outraged and began yelling at Isuri not to give up, because there was still hope. Isuri got angry in response, saying that this was the most rational option. She shouted and asked what other choice they had and offered to play if Kang-min didn't want to sacrifice. And then she yelled at the guy to come up with something to do with this monster himself. Suddenly, the thought of how they could escape flashed through his eyes. Kang-min shouted, "That's right!" Isuri did not understand what was happening. The teenager said there was something in her bag and reached for her briefcase. Isuri turned to the door, her face covered in sweat from fear. On the other side of them was a monster who knew for sure that the teenagers were inside. The monster screamed loudly because it could not reach its victims. The military heard these screams and decided to go upstairs. Meanwhile, Kang-min poured boiling water over the virus cells. They stood with Isuri in the corner in a hug. The guy was holding a thermos and shouting. The teenager was loudly laughing and thinking that they were all about to die. When Kang-min was bringing in the hot water tank, he asked Isuri for a thermos. After that, the teenager joyfully shouted that he had found it. He started rummaging through Isuri's briefcase, asking him to wait until he put it down. Isuri got angry and thought that Kang-min was trying to annoy her, but he only asked for one time. In reality, the teenagers fell to the floor and began to cough loudly. Kang-min held a thermos in his hands, shaking his hands and shouting loudly. He shouted that his prediction had come true. The guy was incredibly happy that it worked. The monster was roaring and boiling. The teenagers looked closely at the monster and made sure that it was completely dead and did not move. Isuri was still in shock and recovering from the fact that they had almost died, and Kang-min was rejoicing. But the question remained how to get out of their hiding place. It seemed that the monster could not transform. Kang-min noticed that Isuri was not happy at all, so he asked her what was wrong, because they had succeeded. He laughed at her when Isuri offered to play to the death, but when the girl turned and looked at him with her murderous gaze, Kang-min immediately apologized. The girl just pushed him and told him that he did a good job. Isuri told Kang-min that he was not afraid and strong. They found a way out, and that was the most important thing. Meanwhile, the military had already reached the corridor where the teenagers were. Suddenly, the soldiers noticed something and stopped, and then called someone. It turned out that they were priests, and they did not look strange or arouse suspicion. The military pointed their weapons and asked them if they were okay, as there were cases of infection. One of them asked in surprise if it was really true, as if he didn't know about it. The soldier said it was dangerous to be here and looked back through the open door. Meanwhile, Kang-min looked at his video that he had recorded on his phone. The teenager carefully examined every detail because something there seemed very strange to him. The video did not show the monster at first, nothing at all. Isuri also decided to watch the video, and Kang-min told her to see that there were no traces. The monster appeared as if from nowhere, very suddenly. Isuri watched and opened her mouth wide in surprise. And then she talked about disputes. The girl explained that they began to mutate. After that, the teenagers decided that they had to run away quickly in case they met again. They turned into a corridor where there was another monster trying to get in. The monster growled, so it was still alive. The teenagers stopped when they saw the monster on their way. They were screaming because they could not believe that there was another monster here. Then the teenagers noticed something downstairs. Black smoke came out from underneath, and the virus cells also darkened. The teenagers realized that there seemed to be a fire outside. There was some noise and commotion outside the door. Then, the teenagers decided to hide behind a pile of boxes that were nearby. Footsteps could be heard outside the door, and the teenagers whispered that soldiers were nearby. Kang Min asked what the soldiers were doing there and added that he didn't know much about them. Isuri agreed, saying that they had to hide. Suddenly, someone flew into them. The teenagers were shocked and frightened by what they saw, because soldiers did not always protect civilians. But it turned out that it was Kang Ji-hoon and Park Jo-ah. They came to rescue their friends, so now they all decided to escape from this crazy place together. Kang Min managed to ask how his friends found them, to which Park Jo-ah said that the monster's screams echoed throughout the building. Then the teenager asked if they knew anything about what had happened, but they did not understand anything. A priest and other pastors met them at the bottom of the stairs. There were also military men next to them, and they were all just quietly discussing something. When the priest saw the teenagers, he was overjoyed, as if they had been waiting for them. The man called them children and said that they had brought Satan into the worship hall. The military simply looked on in silence and did not react. Isuri ignored the priest's words and interrupted him with a question about how he survived, but the man just smiled with his eyes closed. Isuri continued her interrogation and asked if the man was not infected. Everyone was silent, so the girl continued to bombard him with questions about why he was here at all. The priest opened his eyes when Isuri said that it was all strange. He seemed to be annoyed by it all. Suddenly, the soldier pointed his weapon at them and ordered them to move quickly. The other soldiers also pointed their weapons, and the man continued that it was a quarantine procedure, and they would be grateful if the teenagers cooperated with them. The company was very scared and put their hands up. Kang Ji-hoon, as the leader, said for everyone that they were not infected and would cooperate with the military. The priests watched the situation in silence and smiled as if they were enjoying it. Isuri looked at them carefully. She felt something wrong, but she could not understand what it was. Then she whispered to Kang Min and asked if he had seen it too. Isuri looked down and told a classmate to look at the pastor's feet. Kang Min was shocked by what he saw. His eyes widened sharply, and he panicked. After all, the feet of all the priests were infected. They were shedding virus cells, and these pastors were dangerous to them all. Cold sweat ran down Kang Ming's face, and he had to come up with a plan quickly. A drop of the frog egg virus fell on the floor. They began to leave a trail, so the situation became critical. Everything began to happen too quickly, and the pastors did not even have time to react. Kang Ming took out a thermos and shouted to offer the priests hot water. Inside was not just hot water, but real boiling water, which was steaming. The classmates did not understand what their friend had done, and the pastors screamed in pain. Kang Ming finally saw their true faces under their robes and gasped loudly. Their faces began to be covered with virus cells, and they screamed in pain. After that, the priest fell to the floor, and the military immediately rushed to their aid. Suddenly, the man noticed something nearby that he had never seen before in his life. Some strange shadow of a monster ran by him. It looked so unreal, like in a movie. The priest looked at the soldier. His face was dripping with virus cells. Then the soldier realized that something very terrible was about to happen. Suddenly, a huge monster appeared out of nowhere, and it was definitely not positive. The soldier gave the command to open fire on it, but the monster managed to open its mouth and prepared to attack. The teenagers were shocked and frightened, standing in a stupor. The monster pounced on the soldiers who were closer to it and attacked. Kang Ji-hoon was going to run away while they had time, but Isuri said there was no point, because it would find them anyway. The girl continued that the answer was very simple. Whether they were looking for Lee Yeon-woo or not, the teenagers had to kill these creatures themselves. Everything was on fire. The room looked like a post-apocalypse. There were many soldiers lying motionless on the floor, covered with cages. But one soldier still survived and sat on the floor, folding his arms and praying. At the end of the prayer, the man bowed low and asked for strength from the Lord. At that moment, someone called out to him. The soldier looked frightened, with cold sweat running down his face. There were priests and the monster himself, watching the soldier pray. The pastor said that the man would witness a miracle of rebirth into a new life. Then he asked the angel to join them and finish the prayer. The soldier told the pastor to relax, because this is not an angel, but a mutant due to the fusion of all cells, and this is not God's help. The soldier looked these people in the eye and said that they were just sick bastards. The man continued that they were all walking squirrels for the monsters, and nothing more. Hearing this, the monster growled and got into position to pounce. The soldier already understood this, so he simply prepared for his death. The pastor turned away and left, saying that it was Satan. The priest noticed that the children had run away, but his partner said that it didn't matter, because they would find them. They could not escape from here. Meanwhile, the teenagers got to a room with tables and a stage for their performances. They ran very fast when they were running away and just stood there shaking. The room was empty and not infected. There was a briefcase on one of the chairs, and Kang Ming shouted happily when he found it. The teenager grabbed his bag and hugged it, shouting joyfully. The Park Chos were outraged that they had all traveled all this way for one bag. But Kang Min just smiled back, saying that it was not just a bag. The girl was already waiting to see what was inside her. Then the teenager poured out everything inside the briefcase. There were many things that could be useful to them during survival. Others also came up and watched with open mouths to see what was interesting inside. There was fuel, a lighter, and even a Bible. Kang Ji-hoon commented that this was enough for them, but the question remained how they would catch the monster. Then Isuri interrupted the conversation, saying that when she saw them in the worship hall, she realized that they were smart and fast. Moreover, they are very difficult to spot and locate. Kang Ji-hoon replied that they would not look for the monster. Isuri asked how to catch him then. The teenager replied that they would lure the monster here. Footsteps were heard on the stairs. Then the priests came out. They have already checked the first, second, and third floors, and only the basement remains. The pastor told the children that he knew they were here and advised them to repent. Suddenly the priests stopped and looked down. They saw the guy's shadow on the door. The pastors went inside and saw the teenagers there. The man said they hid like rats, but after Kang Ji-hoon's command to start, the priests' mouths dropped open in shock. The teenagers were ready with Molotov cocktails and a flamethrower in the form of a fire extinguisher. They threw their weapons at the men and they flew back in a wave. The pastors screamed in pain because the cocktail immediately worked and everything went up in flames. Kang Ji-hoon ordered everyone to run away as quickly as possible and not to approach the priests. Otherwise, they would be infected. But the pastors did not give up easily. The man was on fire and ordered the teenagers to repent. Otherwise, the angels would punish them. It looked terrible. Kang Ji-hoon ordered the pastor to shut up and shouted at him loudly. Isuri said to watch the stairs because the monster could be there. Kang Ji-hoon stopped for a second and was in a stupor. After all, the monster was there and was already approaching the teenagers. Then the teenager ordered everyone to run away quickly and get out of here. The monster was enraged and furious. It was screaming and ready to attack them. Isuri told the others to hurry up, because the monster was catching up with them. Park Choa turned on the fire extinguisher and sprayed it on the monster. Everything was as if in a fog, which reduced the visibility of the monster, but it was not visible either. The teenagers ran on and Isuri looked back, because she was the last one to run. She saw a monster in the white fog. The girl shouted for the powder to be brought out quickly because they had to drive the monster into the corner of the corridor. Isuri was sure that the monster would fall for their trap. Park Choa told me that she had already used it with Lee Yeon and Namsun Tower, but it didn't work. They argued whether this strategy would work now. Park Choa said that there were many of them, and in any case, they were supposed to be a lure for him. Kang Min was the last to close the door to the stairs. He said to set fire to it from this side and close it. And then he ordered us to run to the door, and Kang Ji-hoon asked if Kang Min was really going to set the monster on fire. After that, he asked for a little more time and ordered Park Choa to run faster. Kang Min stood by the door and cleared his throat loudly, his heart beating furiously. After that, he turned to his friends and told them to stop. Kang Ji-hoon looked back out of the corner of his eye, but he didn't understand what was happening. The monster simply stopped in the middle of the corridor and did not move. Kang Min said the monster simply disappeared. The teenagers thought that the monster could have guessed everything, and now doubted whether he would come here. Kang Ji-hoon ran down the stairs and called out to Park Choa. He asked the girl to wait a bit and assured her that they had a chance. Park Choa ran quickly to the stairs. She was on an important mission, to get there in time to do her job. She motivated herself and begged to make it, and Park Choa ran as fast as she could. Meanwhile, the monster continued to stand in the middle of the corridor and did not move. Then he looked up at the ceiling. It seems that the monster noticed or heard something. Maybe it was footsteps, but now it was clear that the monster had changed its plan. Kang Min noticed this and had to come up with something fast. The monster simply turned around and decided to attack from the other side. Kang Min didn't know what they would do if the monster went to the stairs. They would ruin the whole plan. Then the teenager started screaming and calling the monster to him. Isuri approached him and reached into his briefcase. The monster did not respond to the teenager's cries. It seemed to be smarter than other species. The elder's head began to speak and growl from the back. Isuri took out the Bible and began to tear it, defacing the pages, and the pastor reacted. Kang Min asked Isuri if she had succeeded, because he hadn't seen the monster. But the girl saw him clearly, and realized that the monster saw her too. The monster stopped and turned its head. Isuri had to do something to attract the monster's attention. The girl scattered the leaves of the Bible on the floor. After that, I just stood on them and asked if it worked. The monster growled. Its head turned and looked at what Isuri was doing. Kang Min was happy that they had succeeded and had annoyed the monster. Meanwhile, Park Choa was going down the stairs and running fast. Suddenly, she saw a monster in front of her and could not understand why it was still there. His back was to her, but she had to react quickly and do something. Park Choa reached into her briefcase to take out something, but her panic made it impossible to do so without unnecessary movement and fuss. The monster heard this and turned its head to look. Park Choa caught his gaze and realized in a second that she was in trouble. The monster growled loudly and opened its mouth to pounce on her. The girl swung a Molotov cocktail at the monster with a lighted Molotov cocktail. Meanwhile, some people were running up the stairs to Park Choa. It was Kang Ji-hoon. He was shouting and calling for the girl. The teenager was running as fast as he could when suddenly he stopped. He saw Park Choa, who was barely walking, coming up to him. The first thing Kang Ji-hoon asked her was how she was feeling, and she replied that she was fine. Park Choa was tired and exhausted and said she thought she was going to die. Kang Ji-hoon listened to this with his mouth open, but she was happy that it had worked out. She couldn't believe it herself. Meanwhile, the monster was downstairs and surrounded by fire. The monster looked back, but there was also fire from all sides. Park Choa cleared her throat a bit and listened to Kang Ji-hoon. The teenager yelled at her for risking her life and going alone. Meanwhile, the others joined them and Kang Min was very happy and satisfied that they had succeeded. Park Choa told Kang Ji-hoon that she was annoyed. She pushed him and asked him if he really thought that if they sat here and waited, they would succeed. Park Choa went ahead and called them all slow. Suddenly, she pulled out her cell phone, because I received something strange on it. She called out to the others walking ahead, her tone suggesting something terrible. Park Choa was texting with So-yeon, and she said she was also in the basement. Behind the door in the closet, I could hear someone's sounds bordering on crying. It was So-yeon, almost crying and begging her friends to come to her as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the stairs to the top were on fire, and there was no way to get in. The monster was downstairs in the basement, watching in a stupor as everything burned. Then he began to pray and put his head down. Then he stood up abruptly, throwing his head up. The monster simply stood up on its hind legs and now looked completely human. The monster shouted at the teenagers, calling them devils and saying they would burn in hell. Seon-young sat in the closet and watched in horror. She looked through a small slit, but what she saw made her blood run cold and her heart beat at an incredible rate. Meanwhile, the teenagers discussed their future plan of action. Isuri moved away from everyone while the others looked down at her. The girl asked if her classmates had anything to say, and then added that Seon-young could have been left alone. Isuri argued that the girl had decided to run away alone, so there was no point in looking for her. But Kang Min tried to stop her. Isuri was adamant and interrupted everyone, standing her ground. She asked if her classmates were willing to risk their lives for her. She added that Seon-young was useless among them all anyway, and it would be good if she disappeared altogether. Park Choa yelled at Isuri, saying that Seon-young might have died because of the fire they started. Isuri did not fall for provocations and asked with a calm face if Park Choa really believed that Seon-young did not know. Kang Ji-hoon stood up for his friend, saying that he didn't really like his classmate either, but they had to leave together. Isuri stood her ground, saying that her plan was to get out of this madness as soon as possible, because you never know when the soldiers will come. Kang Min stopped everyone, saying that they could have distracted the monsters and saved Seon-young. Isuri told him not to make the teenager repeat himself and asked why she had to participate in this. Kang Min asked if his classmate was really ready to leave her partner to die. He asked her what Isuri would do if she lost a paper-scissors game to him. Park Choa and Kang Ji-hoon were unaware of what was happening and asked again. Isuri simply told Kang Min to do as he pleased. Then she just turned around and left. Her classmates shouted after her and were outraged. Kang Ming stood in a stupor and did not believe that this was really happening. Kang Ji-hoon ordered me to write So-yeon, and he and Kang Min were going to try again. Isuri stood in front of the door and did not dare to leave. She was at a crossroads and knew that if she left now, she would never come back. Her classmates were running around the floors rescuing their friend, whom they didn't like very much. Isuri thought they were scum. Meanwhile, the monster did not move on and remained in the basement. Suddenly, someone shouted at him, calling him a freak. It was Kang Ji-hoon and Kang Min. They were running to him and calling him names to annoy him. Suddenly, they froze when they saw the monster in person. He was downstairs on a staircase that was burning with fire. The monster was calling them children of Satan and that they would burn in hell. Meanwhile, Park Choa was in hiding and on a mission to find her friend. The monster was too close, so the girl had to be careful. Sung-yeon was sitting inside holding the phone, shaking. When she looked up, she heard the door creak. Then she saw Park Choa in front of her. The girl was the first to watch the monster. She told Sung-yeon that the monster was right in front of them and asked them to be quiet. But her friend didn't understand the orders. Park Choa was annoyed and asked her to shut up and follow her. Seon-young began to panic and almost cry, saying that she really couldn't because she was scared. Park Choa turned to her and asked if she was serious. The girl simply grabbed Seon-young's hand, asking if her classmate wanted to die. The girls were a meter away from the monster, hiding behind the corner of the wall. Park Choa assured them that the monster was not looking at them and was busy with something else. And then, she ordered Seon-young to just run silently and run away as fast as she could. They did it carefully on tiptoe. Park Choa tried to support her friend, whispering to her not to turn back. Seon-young looked down and just followed her friend. But the fear was stronger, and she couldn't help but look back at least out of the corner of her eye. and what she saw made her freeze. Sung-yeon has never seen a monster so close. The girl just broke down and ran away screaming. Park Choa did not understand what had happened and was simply in a stupor. She looked back and saw a terrible picture. The monster roared and immediately attacked the girls. Kang Ji-hoon and Kang Min saw this and started running to their classmates. The monster did not pay attention to them and just chased the girls. Kang Ji-hoon desperately threw herself at him to help her friends. The monster said it was afraid of them and asked for something. The teenager did not understand what was happening. The monster then denied everything and roared. After that, it attacked Kang Ji-hoon, and the teenager fell to the floor. Kang Min was screaming in a stupor. He didn't know what to do or what the plan was. Suddenly, someone called out to him with claims of what the teenagers had done here. It turned out to be Isuri. She said that her classmates were really idiots, holding a tank of boiling water. The girls said she didn't know how to comment on it, because all their survival equipment was in the bag, and ordered her to listen quickly. Meanwhile, the monster screamed and opened its mouth to pounce on Kang Ji-hoon. The teenager was on the floor, the monster's cells tied him up, and the monster told him that they would all die. When Kang Ji-hoon saw that his hands were infected, it was the end of him. The teenager was in a stupor. He did not know how to react and what to do. It was as if everything was broken inside. Kang Ji-hoon looked at his hands and saw the virus penetrating his skin. Meanwhile, the monster did not hesitate to attack the teenager, and the boy only managed to cover himself with his hands. Meanwhile, Kang Min and Isuri wanted to pour boiling water on the monster, and they had to do it as far as possible. Otherwise, they would all die here. Kang Ji-hoon looked back in shock because something had happened. The monster just started running away from them. The teenagers saw this, so they had to move faster. They couldn't just leave it there. Then, Kang Ji-hoon grabbed the monster with his own hands, asking where he was going to run to. It worked. The monster stalled and the teenager held it down. Kang Ji-hoon did not realize what he was doing, but he had nothing to lose. At that moment, the teenagers threw boiling water at the monster, but it also hit Kang Ji-hoon. There was an empty boiling water tank on the floor. Kang Min and Isuri gasped loudly as they looked at the monster. A monster was lying on the floor a little further away, and the teenagers were watching closely to see if they had killed it. Suddenly it growled, and Kang Min was so frightened that his hair stood on end. The monster growled next to Park Choa. The girl was the furthest away and fell to the floor as she ran away. She came back to the shouting to make sure that the danger had passed. Next to him on the floor was Kang Ji-hoon, the monster calling the teenagers children of Satan. Suddenly someone started screaming loudly, and Kang Ji-hoon looked up to see what had happened. It was Park Choa, who attacked the monster with a Molotov cocktail and wished the monster to die. It growled and opened its mouth to pounce back, but he didn't have much strength, and Park Choa managed to attack first, so the cocktail broke and set the monster on fire. Now the monster was definitely overcome. Kang Ming stood up and exhaled a sigh of relief, saying how hard it was. He turned to Park Choa and asked her if she was okay, but she swore at Seong-yeon. The teenager started a roll call and asked if everyone was okay, and then suggested that we leave. But Isuri stopped him. She was looking somewhere to the side and the girl's tone was full of bad news. Kang Min also looked away after his friend. Isuri looked at what had happened with a stone face and let out only a brief indignation that said, "Well, I told you so." Kang Ji-hoon was sitting on the floor, not even getting up. The teenager gasped loudly and looked down, still unable to believe what had happened. Park Choa began to realize, her heart beating faster and her eyes widening. Kang Ji-hoon did not look up and said that he thought he was done. The teenager looked at his hand. It was covered with virus cells, and they were only growing. Kang Min began to panic and deny reality. Isuri mentally realized that the monster did not leave for the very reason that Kang Ji-hoon had captured it. Kang Min approached his friend and started yelling at him not to give up and that he would find a way. He asked if there was any hot water left and offered to take the cells from my hand. But Kang Ji-hoon ordered them to leave quickly, because they understood everything. The teenager did not even dare to look up. He put his hand on his head and said that if he touched his classmates, they would also be infected. It was over. Kang Ji-hoon was ashamed to even look his friends in the eye. Park Choa could not believe her ears and eyes. After all, Kang Ji-hoon became infected because of her. He risked his life for her. Park Choa just started to realize this, and everything seemed to collapse inside her. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon started screaming and ordered everyone to run away quickly. The teenager was just furious. Isuri supported him and ordered everyone to leave, but Kang Min stood there like a pillar. Then the girl repeated herself and asked if they had all heard Kang Ji-hoon. Isuri was the first to leave, adding that they all had to get out of here quickly. She concluded by commenting that the boys had dug themselves into this hole. Next to her, Sung-yeon was standing behind the wall, shivering, waiting for her classmates to come. Suddenly she heard their footsteps and looked out, hoping to see her friends. Sung-yeon was right and called out to her classmates. She was about to start resenting the fact that they were so late, but she was interrupted by Park Choa, who pushed the girl. She was just furious, holding Seon-young by the collar and threatening to kill her. Seon-young began to apologize and make excuses for being scared and unable to help herself. But Park Choa was too angry. It seemed like she was about to burst into flames. Then the girl just threw Sung-yeon away and she flew down to the floor. A classmate was outraged, saying that Park Choa had almost ripped her hair off, but she didn't even look in her direction. Suddenly Sung-yeon asked about Kang Ji-hoon. This made Kang Min's hair stand on end. The teenager opened his mouth to say something or explain, but Seung-yeon asked him again where he was. She kept asking and said that he was supposed to be with them. No one reacted or even looked in Seon-young's direction, so she asked where they had left Kang Ji-hoon. Kang Min ignored this question and asked his friends if they were really going to give up so easily and how long they would run away like this. Isuri thought about these words and what had happened in general. Then she said that it was all Seon-young's fault. The classmate exploded after hearing that. Isuri said that if they didn't want any of them to die, they had to do the right thing and see what was happening outside. Everyone gathered near the church because there was a fire, so the teenagers had to find the back door. Somewhere in the crowd, they saw familiar faces. Kang Min could not believe what he was seeing and screamed out loud. So-yeon also noticed her classmate's response and could not contain her emotions. Meanwhile, the monster, or rather what was left of it, was lying on the floor. Kang Ji-hoon was sitting next to him and loudly snorted. He was getting sick. Sweat was on his face from the smoke caused by the fire and infection. He thought to himself that all of this was meaningless, and that it was best for him not to endure the torment and just die. Kang Ji-hoon's arm hurt terribly. He couldn't even move it. Finally, he asked Lee Hong-mi if his beloved felt the same way at the time. Kang Ji-hoon came to the conclusion that it was his fault, and he apologized to Hong-mi because he had been an asshole at the time. The teenager held a grudge against everyone that was supposed to be directed at him. First, he was angry with Lee Yeon-woo, and then I realized that he was angry with himself. The teenager was apologizing to everyone. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon felt sick. He got up and came to his senses. It was the first time the teenager had ever felt this way. The boy came closer to the monster. He saw in front of him what he could turn into. Kang Ji-hoon didn't want to do that. He didn't want to die. Suddenly, the teenager realized this when he pulled himself together and came to his senses. He looked around and found a canister with boiling water in it. Kang Ji-hoon fixed his gaze on her and decided to act. With no friends around, he had to think of something on his own. The teenager ran to the canister to find boiling water, but there was not a drop inside. Kang Ji-hoon felt as if the ground had slipped away from under his feet, and he only found hope to live. But this emptiness in the canister was infuriating. Kang Ji-hoon became angry, picked up the tank and swung it, cursing loudly. The canister fell and rolled on the floor. The teenager said that he did not want to die. Kang Ji-hoon fell to the floor and started crying because he did not want to end his life like this. The teenager was curled up on the floor crying and thinking about Lee Hong-mi. He remembered their moments together, how he would get into the frame when she was filming her blog. They were so good then, and he wanted it to be like that forever. He always wanted to be with her. Suddenly he saw a shadow coming down the stairs and shouting his name. Kang Ji-hoon began to open his eyes because the voice was very familiar and dear. Suddenly the teenager saw Lee Hong-mi, his beloved, there. She screamed his name and ran to Kang Ji-hoon. Lee Hong-mi, she came for her friend. Meanwhile, the events moved to one of Seoul's Gyeongnam neighborhoods. Somewhere out there among the narrow streets, among the abandoned buildings and shops that have already been looted and destroyed. On the stairs, there were young people talking to each other. The company met on the stairs. The leader of the gang asked the masked man if he had any medicine and said that these were children he had never seen before. They went into a room where very strange things were happening. There were monsters in cages inside. The gang was just passing by. Behind them was Lee Yeon-woo, who was told to watch carefully because this was their new world. The teenager was looking at these monsters. They were suffering. Everyone there was suffering. Jeon-woo stayed for a while and looked at everything that was happening inside. The boss turned to him and welcomed Lee Yeon-woo to their room. A smile appeared on the man's face. The teenager watched what was happening in silence. The monsters were under a strange purple and blue light, and were not dangerous. Jeon-woo realized that these monsters were different from those he had seen before. It was obvious that these were people who had been infected with cells, but Yeon-woo did not see the cells. There were guards standing nearby. They were healthy adult men who protected these monsters. They were talking to each other when suddenly they became interested in something. The guards looked at Yeon-woo, who was sitting close to the monster and examining it. In fact, the teenager raised his hand to feel if there were cells inside, but Jeon-woo did not feel them. Then he wondered if he could touch the monster. The teenager did so, but nothing happened. It was not like touching a real monster. The guard was walking toward Yeon-woo and shouting at him, telling him not to touch anything with his hands. But it seems that the teenager was indifferent and again, in his usual style, did not respond to his words. Jeon-woo continued to study the monster. The guard didn't like it and said out loud that the teenager was not responding to him. Then Han Seong-yu stood up for Yeon-woo, grabbing his classmate and apologizing to the guard. Healthy men looked at what was happening but did not understand anything, so they did not act. Han Seong-yu took Yeon-woo away and apologized again to the men. The teenager asked his classmate what it was and what he saw. Yeon-woo couldn't get those monsters who were infected without cells out of his mind. He asked if this was what Han Seong-yu had told him, but his classmate didn't really understand what kind of cells Yeon-woo was talking about and asked him again. And then he seemed to realize. The teenagers looked at the monsters and Han Seong-yu said that it was flesh. It was the first time Lee Yeon-woo had heard of this, so he asked again. Han Seong-yu said with a cheerful face that these were all people who were addicted to various substances, and as the cells spread, all those monsters became like that. He asked Yeon-woo if he thought it was funny. He went on to say that as long as the monsters did not touch them, they were in the role of test subjects. Meanwhile, in the other corner of the room, the gang was talking about something among themselves. The main man waved to his partners as he spoke to the guards. His gang was waiting for him to tell them about the conversation with them. And so it happened. A man came up and ordered everyone to watch closely. He handed them all some sticks, but no one understood what it was. The man just laughed in response. The girl, meanwhile, looked back. She saw teenagers talking to each other. She didn't seem to like it. She thought they were up to something again, and it was annoying. But Yeon-woo and Han Seong-yu did not pay attention to the gang and did not even return. She thought that she had to distract herself with something else so that she wouldn't be so angry. The main thing that annoyed their gang was that the girl did not listen to him, and he told her about it. While they were talking to each other, one of the monsters began to move strangely and crawl out. The monster deliberately approached the gang, looking for new victims. The girl noticed this and turned around to a growl. Meanwhile, the monster had already climbed out enough. Its tentacles were everywhere. This monster had no face. Its body resembled ice cream that had melted in the sun. The guards also noticed this and went to eliminate the monster. Suddenly, the monster spoke, trying to ask them for something, but the guards did not listen, and the man asked for an ejector. Han Seong-yu told Yeon-woo that these monsters were not supposed to come out, but it happened that one of them woke up and they got rid of it right away. It's all because the monsters continued to be addicted and rebelled strongly without substances. Han Seong-gyu told Yeon-woo not to worry because the teenager saw this almost every day and asked him to wait for him. The teenager ran up to the guards and offered them his help. Meanwhile, the monster was simply burned alive. Lee Yeon-woo stood there looking at this monster and what was happening. Everything seemed very strange. Suddenly, the teenager felt something. He felt a connection to this monster. His arm began to hurt and feel strange, and Yeon-woo did not expect this. Suddenly, the teenager felt all the monsters. He felt their bodies and cells, and it seemed that the monsters also felt Yeon-woo. But the teenager could not understand why it happened now and so suddenly. Perhaps it was because he touched one of them. Suddenly, Yeon-woo felt a terrible pain that interrupted his thoughts. Now he felt all the pain that the monster who was burned alive had experienced. Yeon-woo thought it would be nice if the feelings were divided, like the last time. Meanwhile, the guards fought against the monsters, which became even more numerous. This was very unusual for them, as monsters are usually completely peaceful. Suddenly, someone ordered the guard to stop. It was Lee Yeon-woo standing in front of him and loudly laughing. Suddenly, the man's expression changed dramatically. After all, Yeon-woo's hand was wrapped around these monsters. The teenager tried to transform the monster just like then, but it was harder because he didn't know their specifics. Meanwhile, the guard yelled at the teenager because he did not understand who he was and looked infected. Then Lee Yeon-woo attacked him with the monster he could tie to his arm. Meanwhile, a very arrogant guy with glasses entered the room. He was followed by a security guard, and the men heard screams when they went inside. Yeon-woo and the guard were shouting. The man called him a bastard. Then the guy with the glasses made a gesture. Then he asked what the noise was. He came up to Yeon-woo and asked him questions about who he was, because it was the first time he had seen him. After a while, this guy poured himself a drink in a glass. He called Lee Yeon-woo funny, saying that this was the first time he had seen a person with immunity, and he had only heard gossip before. The guy introduced himself to Yeon-woo as the head of this room, and he was also known as a trader in various substances. The teenager was silent, so the guy asked if he could talk to him and offered him a drink. But Yeon-woo said he was underage. The guy was surprised by this and just drank from his glass. Then the boss asked Yeon-woo if he had come here to sell cells. He continued that the teenager could earn some money because he had a lot of it. Yeon-woo was silent. Only the boy spoke. He asked if the teenager had seen the infected outside. The main one wanted to say that they were as infected as Yeon-woo, but they were using substances. The guy paused and then said that he was happy about this fact. And then he went on to say that the funny thing was that even if they got infected, the cells mutated in a strange and peculiar way. After that, the boss paused again and then said that he couldn't tell Yeon-woo everything in detail, but that wasn't the point right now. The chief looked Yeon-woo in the eye and asked if the teenager could do him a favor. He asked what kind of service it was. The guy just said that it was a very important matter. He said that there was a VIP room downstairs, and there was a certain thing inside. Jeon-woo interrupted and asked why he had chosen him to ask for a favor. The head asked to listen to the end, because the teenager was infected and therefore only he could do it. Then the guy stood up and said that if Jeon-woo found out what was in there, he would hardly refuse, because the boss knew how to overcome the cages. He asked if the teenager understood what he meant and then looked Yeon-woo in the eye and said that there was medicine in there.